CGTN, China Global Television Network.
I'm deeply frustrated with what's happening in Libya, and I think that what's happening is a scandal. We had a number of countries coming together in Berlin where they committed not to interfere in the Libyan process, and they committed not to send weapons or to participate on any way in the fighting. Now, the truth is that the Security Council embargo remains violated.
It is a conflict that has now spanned almost a decade since former Libyan leader Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was deposed in 2011. What seemingly started out as a domestic uprising has over the years morphed into a frontline for international proxy wars. Today, Libya is a bazaar of foreign illicit arms and mercenaries in what is turning out to be a stage of gross international failure to bring peace to the people of Libya. Multiple attempts to bring warring factions to an agreement are yet to bear fruit as the voice of the Libyan people continues to be drowned out in a myriad of international and domestic players' interests. The United Nations now warns that time could be running out for the North African country. So what are the interests at play in Libya? And why does a peace deal remain elusive? And where is the voice of the African Union in the middle of all this? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, the coastal city of Sirte is the latest flashpoint in Libya's protracted war. Recent weeks have seen Turkish-backed forces of the Government of National Accord advance towards this city, dubbed the Red Line. Sirte is the gateway to strategically significant oil fields, and now the battle for its control has drawn neighboring Egypt's military into readiness to intervene in the advance. Daniel Arap Moy reports.
Libyan government forces' threat to recapture Sirte will soon be effected. Troops have been moving towards the city, which could soon be the latest frontline for the warring factions.
As part of our preparation to complete the second stage of liberating Sirte and Jufra region, our forces are preparing for this stage, and these troops are part of the forces as you see now. They're getting ready to go to the fighting points, and you'll hear the good news in the coming days.
Over 200 military vehicles with personnel have been moving towards the city as tensions rise in the region. Sirte is a gateway to Libya's main oil terminals, and its capture will be one of the biggest gains by government troops against forces allied to Eastern Commander Khalifa Haftar, but only if it happens. The Government of National Accord is banking on Turkey's military support. This support has seen Haftar's forces lose ground in the recent past. As government troops and military arms move to what could be the next controversial military theater of action in Libya, Russia, the United Arab Emirates and Egypt have threatened to intervene. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN.
Well, let's take a deeper look now at the Libyan crisis. And for more on that, I'm joined by Dr. Gamal Abdel Gawad. He's joining us from Cairo. He's a senior research fellow and academic advisor at the Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies. And joining us from Nairobi via Zoom is Ambassador Erastus Mwencha. He's the former deputy chairperson to the African Union Commission and currently chairperson to the Africa Capacity Building Foundation. And also joining us in Nairobi is Dr. Mustafa Yusuf Ali. He's the CEO of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies and a conflict resolution expert. Gentlemen, thank you very much for finding the time to join us here on Talk Africa. Dr. Mustafa, let me start with you though, because I want you to take us through what you know so far of the conflict in Libya, because the Libyan conflict has now morphed into a multi-layered conflict. First, let us look at the current players in the conflict. Who are they and what is their interest?
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Libyan conflict has been transformed significantly since it started way back in 2011 when under the guise of UN Security Council Resolution 1973, NATO forces bombed Libya and led to the removal and killing of Muammar Gaddafi. And since then, you've had various factions fighting for power, for control, both in eastern parts of Libya, in western parts of Libya. Today, we have the government of national accord led by Fayad al-Sarraj, which is the one that is controlling Tripoli. And we also have the other faction, major faction to the conflict, led by the National Libyan Army commander Khalifa Haftar. Now, there is significant foreign, direct foreign military intervention on both sides in support of the government of national accord led by Fayaz al-Sarraj and Khalifa Haftar. Turkey and Qatar have been supporting the government of national accord. And on the other side, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Russia have been supporting the Libyan National Army leader, Khalifa Haftar. There have been significant escalations in the recent months, particularly when Khalifa Haftar went into the western parts, attempted a takeover of Tripoli and was repulsed, and the government of national accord took over parts that Khalifa Haftar had taken in northwestern Libya and Tripoli. And now the government of national accord is trying to take out positions that Khalifa Haftar has taken in parts of eastern Libya. That's where the conflict is today, Beatrice.
All right, so there is a lot of convoluted, dynamics going on here. So, Dr. Gamal, the dynamics of Libya's war have now transformed considerably, and recently Egypt threatened to send in troops, though, to and is backing General Khalifa Haftar there. Turkey has sent support to back the government of national unity. What are the interests of Egypt here, and what are the interests of Turkey? What do these two parties want in Libya?
Well, the Egyptian interests are quite obvious and clear in this conflict. Libya is next door to Egypt, and in the past few years, because of the chaotic situation in Libya, terrorists and terrorist groups have been building up on the Libyan side of the border and launching attacks on Egyptian soil, and there has been a number of very brutal killings and attacks by those terrorist, Libya-based terrorist groups in Egypt. And Egypt is very keen to stabilize the situation in Libya, is very keen to secure at least the part of Libya that's next to Egypt, the eastern part of Libya. So Egyptian interest is essentially security interest, which is created and justified by the geographic proximity of the two nations. Turkey, on the other hand, is just traveling across the Mediterranean to support the government in the Tripoli-based government in Libya, and to provide it with military supplies and with mercenaries transferred from Syria, etc. This is essentially a kind of ideological interest here. The Islamist ideologies that is shared by the government of Tripoli and the regime in Turkey creates a kind of common interest between them. And on the other hand, also, Turkey, under the current regime of Erdogan, is seeking some sort of expansionist policy in the Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East. We have seen active aggressive policy of Turkey in Syria, in Iraq, and now in Libya. So this is, we have here two rationale, a rationale of maintaining the status quo. This is essentially the Egyptian interest, providing for security and stability. And on the other hand, we see the rationale and the goals of Turkey of creating a new reality, a new regime, a new ideological coalition, and a new interest in North Africa.
Right. So, Ambassador Mwenche, let's look at the mediation efforts here, because the government of national accord is an interim government for Libya and was formed under the terms of a UN-led initiative. Why a UN-led initiative? Is it also African Union-backed? Where is the African Union here?
Well, that has to do with the genesis of the problem itself, because if you remember and recall, when the crisis broke out in Libya in 2011, the African heads of state and government were very much seized on the matter. And in fact, on the eve of NATO bombing, there were 7 heads of state and government in mugshot, ready to go to Tripoli to talk to Gaddafi, so that there would be smooth transition and not cause a bloodshed like what we have witnessed. But that very moment when they were ready to go, NATO forces asked them not to move. And if they moved to Libya, that would have been at their own peril. That then left the African countries with no choice but to leave the matter to the UN, because the UN sanctioned, which also, sanctioned the attack through the UN resolution 1973. And so they started bombing and created the mess that we now find ourselves in. And Africa, for a long time, took the position that the UN, US, and some European countries created a mess and let them correct it. But for many years they tried, they would not. But eventually, being, of course, an African country, the challenge and the problem is in Africa, Africa went in reluctantly. So that is why Africa has not been very much involved. But of course, as it has been pointed earlier by Mustafa, it has now become a theater of proxy wars. We have seen, Europe is divided in 2 camps. There are those supporting the government recognized by the international community, which is based in Tripoli. And then we have seen some countries supporting Haftar. And that has also brought other forces from outside. So now that has become extremely complicated to solve. And I think even as it is, because it is not necessarily a problem that is in Africa, it is a global problem. The solution should also be global.
So you're bringing up a very interesting point here, Ambassador Mwenche, because you say Africa has not been very much involved. And I want to go back to the Berlin conference on Libya in January, which excluded even Libyan participants and still insisted on inclusivity and national ownership as fundamental principles in resolving the Libyan conflict. So do you see inclusion and ownership in efforts, though, to find a solution for Libya, particularly from the Libyan side?
Well, that's ironic. But of course, if you look at the Berlin conference, one of the key objectives was to get agreement among the international community that are interfering in this conflict, to agree among themselves so that they could reach some ceasefire, but also withdraw from Libya and leave the Libyans to settle their own problem. So that was one of them. The second one, of course, it was also to call upon them not to continue to supply arms. You know, there was a UN resolution again, or embargo, which has been running since 2011, and which they continue to violate. The third one, of course, then was to enable the Libyans themselves to start the process of internal reconciliation and the peacemaking and the rest. And so the 2 objectives, of course, then meant that Libya had nothing to do with how these parties come in. They must withdraw from there and leave the Libyans to solve. And that's why Libya was not involved. But of course, any agreement which doesn't involve Libya would, of course, falter. And that's why, after that agreement, what Mustafa said, prevailed, because that's when Haftar started attacking to try and take Tripoli, and he was getting support from the Russians and the others. And of course, when he failed, you can see that the situation has now become more and more complicated.
Dr. Mustafa, there is a lot, as we've heard here, there seems to be a lot of foreign interest in what is going on in Libya. One has to ask, though, at this point, who exactly is in control? Is anyone in control in Libya? And where are the voices of the Libyan people? What are their thoughts on how to resolve the crisis?
Yeah, Beatrice, it's very clear that the two powers, the two protagonists of the conflict, the Libyan National Army and the Government of National Accord, in themselves are not able to govern Libya, are not even able to win the war by themselves. And therefore, you have these foreign interests that have come in, and there are a number of interests here. If you look at Turkey and Qatar, they are interested in their own agenda. One is power. One is their brand of ideology that they envision for the Middle East and North Africa, which may not be very helpful. And you also have those two powers also very keen on oil and gas. That is very much a lot of those commodities are found in Libya.
All right, very interesting discussion. Gentlemen, do stay with us. We'll take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll continue with more on Libya in a moment.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, my guests are still with us. Dr. Gamal Abdel Gawad is joining us from Cairo. Ambassador Erastus Mwencha, a former deputy chairperson to the African Union Commission, and Dr. Mustafa Yusuf Ali, both joining us from Nairobi. Let's look at the scenarios that are likely to unfold with a recent, involvement by the troops of, supported by Turkey and supported by Egypt. What do you see as the likely scenarios we are going to witness with Egypt's decision to send troops into Libya? Or is there a danger, for instance, of direct confrontation by the rival powers in Libya?
Well, what's happening on the ground now is on the war front, it is quiet, but there is a military build-up on the two sides. But the two sides also are careful not to trigger a military confrontation. This is number one. Number two, we see attempts at mediation. We see an effort by the Moroccan government. Morocco was the country that hosted the Skhirat negotiation that generated and produced the Skhirat arrangement, political arrangement in Libya. Now Morocco is coming back again, and recently there has been visits by representatives of both governments, high-profile representatives of both governments in Morocco, negotiating, talking, not really negotiating, but communicating and talking. And this is number two. Number three, there has been Saudi Arabia has been coming into the picture. A regional tour made by the Saudi foreign minister to Egypt, to Tunisia, to Algeria, declaring Saudi support for the Egypt-led bloc and inviting Tunisia and Algeria to take more active role in support of this bloc. So we see a kind of a consolidation of this bloc for some extent. At the same time, we see a number of very carefully made declaration by President Sisi of Egypt, emphasizing the fact that Egypt is not for war in Libya. Egypt there for stabilization rather than for changing the status quo or for getting militarily involved there. In other words, Turkey on the one hand and Egypt on the other, and their supporting regional actors, I think are quite careful not to make the situation in Libya explode. What is likely to happen? I think very low intensity conflict in Libya in the medium range. A lot of political talk, not necessarily yielding any results, but at least would function as a kind of a safety valve that wouldn't allow the situation to escalate or to explode. So no peace, no war, but a kind of moving on place, if we can call it.
Dr. Mustafa, your thoughts?
Yeah, there's going to be an escalation of military conflict in Libya. If Egypt is going to get in a grand scale in Libya, Egypt's involvement might change the balance of power in Libya between the protagonists, Khalifa Haftar and the government of national accord led by Fayez and Serraj. And that's in the short term. There will be a lot of fighting, and the country will be awash with weapons. There'll be a number of groups that will be activated, mercenaries in large scale deployed again in Libya. In the medium term and long term, the entry of Egypt might then mean that there is a stalemate, and then the two parties come to the negotiating table again to resolve the issues, the core issues that Libyans want to see resolved. But these are issues that are still not very clear in a strategic sense, Beatrice, how then Egypt is going to continue and to deploy all the way into the western parts of Libya. But certainly, entry is going to support Khalifa Haftar, and is going to be much stronger in the east, and will maintain his position in Benghazi and the entire eastern parts of Libya.
Ambassador Mwancha, you have been watching Egypt for a very long time, since 2011. I want to hear your thoughts on what you see unfolding and the likely scenarios we are going to see in Egypt now moving forward. The panelists are saying it's going to be a state of no peace but no war. Your thoughts?
The African good practices dictate that neighboring countries should desist from either sending stabilizing forces or intervening in a situation like what was an internal issue in Libya by neighboring states. And I am not sure that Egypt's involvement in the long run is going to be to the advantage of Egypt. It will suck in Egypt because obviously, having taken sides, whichever side loses, they will have a bond to issue, a bond of contention with Egypt. Or if the side that is not pro-Egypt wins, you would have strained relationship. I would have thought that Egypt could have used other means rather than intervene directly. But now that Egypt is in there, it's going to be long drawn out, as Mustafa said, and it's going to be bloody. And of course, as you can see, on the side of Egypt, you have Russia and others like UAE and the rest who are there also in a big way. In fact, in the last few days, they have captured oil fields, and these were contractors of Russia. Now, this is going to complicate the situation because the people of Libya themselves may not be very happy to see foreign forces coming to exploit their resources in times when they are in this kind of situation. On the other hand, of course, this very much remains an international issue. The UN must move in decisively. Of course, UN, as we know, it only works when the P5 agree. And I can't see how the P5 are going to agree, because you already know that like France is supporting one side, and you know, for instance, other countries in Europe are supporting the government in Tripoli. The US, although, you know, at one stage looked ambivalent, is supporting the government in Egypt. So this is a complex situation. It is not, we have said again, it is not even a Libyan issue. It is not an African issue. It is a UN issue. And the UN, as it is at the moment, being toothless, it's going to be a long, drawn-out crisis.
So, Dr. Gamal, this is a complex issue. The major international powers seem unsure of how to resolve this long-running conflict in Libya. So what are the options left? What next?
Well, let me say here that there is international responsibility to the situation on Libya. The situation couldn't have developed into the current stage without the way the Western countries have managed this conflict from the very beginning. There was a Gaddafi regime with all the negative things we know about the Gaddafi regime, but it was a functioning government able to provide for security and stability in Libya. Now, there has been a revolt against the Gaddafi regime, and there has been a Western involvement to help the rebels in Libya. Fine, but if you get in, you should not leave before finishing the job. They just helped dismantle the Gaddafi regime and abandoned Libya before taking this to the end, before helping the Libyans to build a functioning regime there. And in the Middle East and North Africa at the time, it was going through a kind of a revolutionary upheaval, and there was all kinds of ideological forces competing for power there. Libya and Libyans without much of political experience get divided between them, and the country became a focal point for all local, regional, and international conflict here. So now I think the international actors and Western actors in particular have responsibility to help restore peace in Libya. The regional actors are facing each other there, and without constructive role from the international community, from the United States, from the European Union, I don't think this situation is likely to end soon.
Gentlemen, a very interesting discussion indeed on Libya's crisis and the way forward. And that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. Thank you to our guests for their insights. Dr. Gamal Abdel Gawad in Cairo. He's a senior research fellow and academic advisor at the Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies. Ambassador Erastus Mwencha, the former deputy chairperson to the African Union Commission and currently chairperson to the Africa Capacity Building Foundation, and Dr. Mustafa Yusuf, the CEO of Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies and a conflict resolution expert, joining us there via Zoom. And thank you for tuning into the program. We'd love to hear your feedback on this topic through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. And you can also catch this and more episodes of Talk Africa on the CGTN Africa website and our YouTube playlist. See you again next week. From me, Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.